Hello everyone, I'm Asha Nayaswami and we're continuing our study of the essence of the Bhagavad Gita, Paramahansa Yogananda's teachings as remembered by his disciple Swami Kriyananda. And we are now in chapter 13 of the book, which is only chapter 3 of the Gita. We just started our last week with the first verse of chapter 3, and now we'll read the second one, but I'm going to read the first one first because the second one refers to the first. I'm sure you could follow all that. It'll be obvious. Chapter 3, stanza 1 of the Gita. Arjuna said, O Janandana, Krishna, the divine liberator, if, as it seems, you consider understanding superior to action, why, O Keshava, have you been urging me to this terrible action? The terrible action he refers to is the battle of Kurukshetra. That's the whole setting here. Arjuna wants him to pick up his weapons and fight. Krishna wants Arjuna to pick up his weapons and fight. And Arjuna is questioning whether or not that's really a good idea. And that's what the whole Gita is. So chapter 3, stanza number 2, Arjuna speaking still to Krishna. This apparent contradiction confuses me. Please tell me clearly, which path will help me toward the highest good? Isn't that the prayer that we're always offering? Lord, please tell me, just tell me what I'm supposed to do and then I'll do it. You know, in the early years of Ananda, in the 70s, when all of this, being an American and having spent most of my life in America, except for all of my life in America, except for occasional sometimes extended visits, but nonetheless, just as a tourist around the world, I think in terms of sort of how these spiritual teachings were introduced to Western society, and I was there at the very early part, from the mid-60s. Life is, enough years have gone through this incarnation that I've seen a lot happen. And now let me think where I was trying to go with that. Oh gosh, isn't that funny? I completely forgot my thought, so I'll drink water and see if it comes back to me. Isn't that interesting? It just completely went out of my head, so we'll just start somewhere else. So, oh yes, this is what I was thinking. When I was first part of the, what started out as kind of the hippies, then the back to the land, then the embracing of Eastern teachings, and then the sudden influx of mostly Indian, but some American gurus onto the scene, and people sort of looking for their path. And Autobiography of a Yogi was a huge influence in that movement. And Autobiography of a Yogi is all about discipleship, and it's all about the power of the guru, whether it's Sri Yukteswar or Babaji. Master himself comes across much sort of under the radar a little bit. His whole story is about others, about Lahiri Mahashaya and all these different gurus, and gives you the impression, as Swamiji said, that you just can go to India and stand on a street corner and spread out your arms and some great master will come and tap you on the chest and that'll settle it for you. So this strange sort of dichotomy developed in contradictory attitude developed among Westerners, which is, on one hand, they were looking for someone, some master who would tell them what to do and make their lives work. And on the other hand, there was this tremendous anti-authority, rebellious attitude among the very same class of people, and sometimes it was right in the same individual, where don't you tell me anything to do, don't you tell me what to do, who are you to tell me what to do? And those forces just played themselves out in a very, very complicated way. And sometimes in the experiences that I've had of trying to communicate to people who are just being introduced to these teachings, who are from a Western context and therefore do not have the benefit of an upbringing in Indian culture, where it's all much better understood, somewhat diminished because we're just coming out of a lower age, but at least the concept is more clear. They would talk to me about, I don't want to become a disciple because I don't want anybody telling me what to do. And especially growing up, spiritually speaking, with Swami Kriyananda, who really never told anybody what to do. So much so that many people failed even to appreciate what he could tell them if they were receptive to it. And also hearing from him really how Master actually related to people. And I'll go a step further, reading autobiography carefully enough to realize that no true Master takes over anybody's willpower or free will, for a very simple reason. It doesn't accomplish anything of what you're really trying to accomplish. You know, the institutional model of religion is that the rules are laid down and you follow them. And when you follow them, you know that you are a good fill in the blank, Benedictine monk or Dominican nun or Buddhist or whatever it might be, or Hebrew student, or I'm trying to enclose everybody. There's a way in which it's laid out for you outwardly, you match it outwardly, and then it is assumed that you are also inwardly in tune with it. But of course, that assumption is not necessarily valid. A true master understands that spiritual growth has to be an expansion from the inside of every individual, so that their actual perception of reality gradually shifts. So it isn't just a question of doing the right thing because I know what the right thing is. It's simply being who I am meant to be by God, because that is the only choice that I have. That I'm just simply myself, and the process of spiritual growth is gradually to elevate that reality of self until it matches our true divine potential. In this, in keeping with this point of view, and I really want to bookmark where I started back with the Gita stanza, but I will come back to it. I had an experience with Swamiji that I actually chronicled in the book, the first book I wrote about Swamiji. I say the first because I'm going to pull this out, because this book needs to be appreciated. Swami Kriyananda, as we have known him, which is a collection of, I think it's actually several hundred individual experiences, my own and others, that people had with Swami Kriyananda. I'm replacing this, I'm supplementing this with the soon-to-be-published chronological story of 45 years of life with Swami, but I hope the new book draws attention back to this one. This is a heavy book. The book I'm writing is even longer. Not quite, well, it's about a third again as big, so I seem to like to use a lot of words. Anyway, moving right along. One of the stories in this book, which I've included, I'm going to repeat again here, and this is how it all went. I'm 22 years younger than Swami Kriyananda. I met him when I was 22, so he was 44. I moved to Ananda village just before my 24th birthday, and from then on I was in continuous contact with Swami. I often lived thousands of miles away from where he lived, but between the telephone and email and frequent travels, his and mine, we were in continuous contact. That's simply the way to put it for all those years. And naturally, the 22-year gap between us always remained. And I was a very feisty young person. I had grown up quite confident in my point of view. My parents respected me, and I respected myself, and I was more than a little bit arrogant and overconfident in my point of view. So I never hesitated to speak my mind or even to insist on my point of view, even when, in retrospect, I am mortified to realize there was absolutely nothing behind it except some randomly acquired opinion that then I would defend as if it actually had merit. Well, time passed, as time does, and when I was about 40, I became responsible. I was one of the people responsible for the work of Ananda Palo Alto, where I've been ever since. And gradually over time, I got old enough that I was dealing with people who were 22 years or more younger than I. And I got to see sort of that stage of life from a slightly different stage of life. And in some of the wonderful, enthusiastic, intelligent, confident, feisty young people I met, I saw myself. And from time to time, it would occur to me that some of the opinions they insisted upon were based on nothing at all, but just randomly acquired, and there was no real reason for them to insist. And it would cross my mind sometimes to say unkind things, like, how would you know? But I restrained myself for a number of reasons, not the least of which was that as I reflected, I realized that not once in 45 years of association with Swamiji, did he ever denigrate my opinion on the basis of my lack of experience, and not once did he ever refer to my age. He just never did. It never came up. And believe me, there were lots of times when it must have crossed his mind, at least so I thought. So when I had this realization, the next time I saw Swamiji and had the opportunity, I told him how much I appreciated that and how grateful I was that he had respected me, or I would use the word, would be more clear, he encouraged me, he supported me as I grew up and gradually expanded my understanding and got more subtle basis for my point of view and more actual experience to back it up. So when I thanked him for that, when I explained the whole thing that I've just explained to you, he accepted my gratitude in a gracious way, because he was always gracious. But the nuances with Swamiji were always so interesting, because I could tell as he accepted it that it wasn't unfinished, that there was something more going on that I hadn't yet understood. So after just a very brief pause, he finished the thought for me. I had said to him specifically, "Sir, in all these years you never mentioned my chronological age." Swami said quite simply, "Well, I never noticed." And then he said, "I never notice anyone's age." He said, "Not even children." He said, "Chronological age is an indication of nothing, really." He didn't say that, I'm saying it. He said, "Chronological age is just the age of your body. The soul is ageless." That's how he put it. And every soul is as old as God. And Swamiji always related appropriately. So when a 7-year-old is in front of him, he doesn't talk to that person as he would talk to someone who's been 50 years doing Kriya. But it wouldn't be because he looks and said, "Oh, you're just 7 years old." It was because, as he put it, I never look at people's eyes. I always look into people's eyes. And the eyes are the window to the soul. And he would look into a person's eyes, feel their consciousness, and then intuitively respond according to what would be helpful to that person's consciousness, according to the language and manner that would vibrate with them. Swamiji, we tend to think that people of elevated consciousness intellectualize their decisions, that it's a rational process of deciding what to say. I mean, these are all the things that we project from our limited understanding, that I projected and gradually came to see as otherwise from my long association with him. Swami just, he doesn't interfere with the flow of intuition. He didn't interfere with the flow of superconscious understanding. So when he talked to me, he didn't think, well, she's, this age or this time or this has experience. He just heard what I said, felt what the helpful response would be, and offered it. And that particular experience was a real key in helping me to just turn a whole lot of my understanding of the spiritual path, because I had presumed that Swamiji was very disciplined in his responses. And he looks like he's very disciplined in his responses. And I can be disciplined in my responses. And what I mean by that is different forces will assert themselves within me. And over many years of spiritual practice, I have learned how to give my commitment to that flow of energy within me that is the highest of which I am capable and is the closest to Dharma. With Swamiji, it wasn't a matter of conflicting energies. There were no conflicting energies. I know that's a very bold statement, but I believe that's true. There were no conflicting energies. So he would just simply, his consciousness was such that he would just perceive this world in a certain way. And he would respond accordingly. And that certain way was, I'm here to serve. And I am here to serve. I can say that same thing. But within me, these forces war a little bit more. So sometimes my response is disciplined. I mean, victory for me is to give a disciplined response. Higher victory is to not have two conflicting points of view. I had a very interesting experience with that. I mean, I suppose it's contradictory to be proud of responding correctly. And spiritual pride, they say, is the hardest kind of pride to get over, because you actually have something to be proud of. Whereas all other pride is just an illusion anyway, and it will soon come to pieces. So when I say I was proud of it, what I mean more is that I was delighted by it. And it was a very challenging situation. It was after this woman filed a lawsuit against Swamiji and Ananda and all of us for, every kind of abuse that you can possibly attribute to to a cult, which is how we were characterized. And it didn't go well for us, that whole litigation, to a very large extent, because the charges were so preposterous. We thought they would be so easy to disprove, and we were very naive. And that's a whole other story that is contained in the book I'm about to publish and is also talked about in the one I held up earlier. So I won't really go there, but I'll suffice to say, after this month-long, I think it was 4 weeks, this was in 1998, so forgive me, it was more than 20 years ago now. After this long trial in front of a jury, every day of which was not a day that you want to live over again. I understand in our life review we get to live over every day, so I hope that those days go by really fast. Finally, the jury returns and it has its verdict, and the verdict went against us. I mean, the opposing lawyer did a extremely skillful job of making the jury believe something that wasn't true. Nonetheless, so the vote went against us, and we were deemed culpable for inflicting emotional harm upon this woman and so on. It was an absolute tissue of lies. But in the moment, what happened was, in the moment that they gave the verdict, my first thought, and I'll pat myself spiritually on the back, I'll pat myself on the spiritual eye. My first thought in that moment was, oh, that poor woman. I mean, it's bad enough that she created this completely false story and made herself into a victim when she was never a victim, but now she's actually won. And she'll get money and she'll get praise for having done this, and it will just take her that much longer to ever just sort of unwind this karma and get back to some position of dharma. And that's the feeling that stayed with me the whole time. It just like, oh, poor thing. And I don't always rise to that level. I don't want to pretend that I'm so pure of heart that no other forces ever come through me. But every so often when grace descends, you see what is possible. When Elizabeth and Corrie ten Boom, who were Dutch Christians who helped the Jews during World War II, both of them ended up in a concentration camp because of that. And Betsy died in the concentration camp, and her younger sister Corrie lived through it and then had a long and beautiful life testifying to the love and power of Christ. Betsy was her older sister and her mentor in many ways. And at one point when they were just in some horrible situation, the two sisters, we all know, we've all seen those vivid scenes. They're just horrible there. Betsy became so sympathetic and started telling Corrie that they really must pray for these people. These poor, poor people, they needed the love of Jesus, and she pleaded with Corrie to pray for these people. And Corrie, of course, is looking around at all her fellow prisoners, looking at her poor own starved and tortured body, and just thinking, my gosh, yes, we certainly do need these prayers. But then after a moment, Corrie realized that Betsy was talking about the guards. She wasn't talking about the prisoners. She was talking about those who were oppressing the prisoners, some of them in the most brutal ways. because Betsy saw that the karma for what they were doing was going to cause them a great deal of suffering. Betsy didn't have a theology that was about reincarnation, or maybe she intuited it, who knows. But she knew that as you sow, so shall you reap. And he who lives by the sword dies by the sword. A few of the aphorisms from Jesus to whom she was devoted, that they would not find happiness or freedom from doing this. And all of Betsy's compassion went out to them. The prisoners were suffering, but those who were perpetrating the suffering upon them, their suffering ultimately would be much worse. I mean, now that is compassion. That's total and complete self-forgetfulness, and that is, in fact, where we're going. Now, coming back to all of this, where I started and how I went off on that, I hope you consider worthwhile tangent, is where Arjuna just pleads with Krishna, tell me what I'm supposed to do. And of course, Krishna does. The rest of the Gita is all trying to give him the principles so that he will be able to make his own decisions. One of the things that was characteristic of Swami Kriyananda, which I have tried very much to convey in this book that's about to be published about him, is it isn't enough just to say, this is what he said, this is what he thinks we should do, this is right, this is wrong. What Swamiji did his whole life was he also expressed to us how he arrived at those conclusions. And it wasn't only or even mostly that Master told me to do it, although Master told him to do most of what he did. I mean, in the sense of inwardly inspired him. He was always guided by the inward presence of Master. But you can also create logical bridges. You can also create context for why inspiration has merit. Or you have the beginning of inspiration. You begin with inspiration, and then you have to fill out what that inspiration implies. And the process of being able to do that in what I would call an intuitively rational manner, where both sides, both reason and feeling, work together, is what really allows us not merely to behave, but also to transform. Because if we behave only because we're afraid of going to hell, or we're afraid of getting humiliated, or we're afraid of having to think for ourselves, then when the pressure gets too strong, we won't be able to hold it anymore. There was a very poignant story that I heard in that context. Many years ago, I believe it was a soccer team or a rugby team, and it was either from Uruguay, might have been Uruguay, maybe it was Ecuador. It was a famous story at the time. A rugby team, I believe, was flying over the Andes in South America, and the plane crashed into the mountain. And everyone was presumed dead, but in actual fact, a small number of them lived through it. Eventually, one or two of the survivors walked out of the Andes and brought help back to rescue the handful that were left. There's a book called Alive, and there were several other movies made from it. It's a bit grisly and a very dramatic story, but it's also a profoundly inspiring one because of the courage and the divine faith these people had. But they also, I've read several accounts from different points of view on this, and one of them was very interesting, and it was about who survived and who didn't, and why they survived and why they didn't. They were all devout Catholics. It was simply part of who they were. And very early on, what happened was they had a radio for a short time before the batteries died, and at a certain point, they heard on the radio that the search parties had given up. So here are these people who are alive in this plane wreckage in the Andes here, that nobody is looking for them anymore. I mean, you can imagine how disheartening that was. And as it happened, now if I get this straight, there was one man who was the captain of the team, and he was the natural leader of the group, and he survived the initial crash. And even after they crashed, because of his charisma and the respect they had for him, he maintained his position of leadership. And they all were desperately appealing to God through the the Catholic prayers and so on that they were accustomed to. But when that man heard that the search had been given up, he had a terrible crisis of faith. And the crisis of faith was, he'd done everything he'd been told to do. And now it seemed God was abandoning him. And he immediately at that point lost heart. And very soon after that he died. Because it was an outward system he'd followed. When that outward system in his own mind collapsed on him, he didn't have a place to go. Interestingly, many of the other men, which is what, and there were some women there too, but I think the women died early. I think it was just men by the end. Sisters and mothers had been traveling too. Most of the men had some kind of internal spiritual perception that was an active part of their ability to survive. And if they translated it into the theology they were used to, but it emanated from inside. So when a master works with a disciple, when Krishna works with Arjuna, when Yogananda worked with Kriyananda, when Kriyananda worked with us, it's to awaken our own potential, or to put it a different way, to awaken us to our own potential, because we all have exactly the same divine potential, but the process is for each one to become aware of that potential and to lift our vibration actually to that potential. And then, so Swamiji goes on in this particular commentary on these stanzas, which goes on for several pages, to talk about how the spiritual path is not an arduous climb. It's, as he puts it, it's like a hot air balloon rising, and the way you make the balloon rise is you toss out that which holds it down. You remove the ballast, as they call it. You remove the ballast, and then the hot air balloon automatically rises. So this is very important for us to understand sort of how this process works, because much of theology, especially Western theology, emphasizes the fact that we're all sinners, that we're dark. And Freudian psychology emphasizes that our basic nature is animalistic, and Darwinian evolution tells us that we're just an inch above the monkeys. And it all sort of describes us as being very limited and very base in our essential nature, whereas the concept of self-realization is that we are pure gold. And the appearance we have of anything less than that is literally because we have buried ourselves in mud. And the nature of gold, which is one of the reasons it's believed to be valuable. The real reason metals are precious and precious gems are precious is because they actually radiate energy. But we've been through Kali Yuga, we've been through a dark materialistic age, so people's sense of why these things are valuable, and I wear 2 rings that are gold and both have gemstones in them, and it's not because they're beautiful, but it's not because they're beautiful, and I don't wear them because they're somewhat expensive. I wear them because they actually emanate energy, and the astrological bangle, which is gold, silver, and copper, these actually emanate energy. And so in higher ages, kings and people in positions of influence and leadership knew that they needed to gather as much energy as they could in order to carry out their responsibilities. And if you add to that an understanding of the astrological relationship between certain planets and certain gemstones and certain metals, this bangle, for example, is a specific universal formula that strengthens everyone's aura. And it's an exact proportion in weight of those 3 metals combined. And so, now let me think just where I was with that. Oh yes, now we talk about the nature of gold as being so valuable because no matter what happens to it, it retains its purity. You can also think about a diamond in the same way. You can take a piece of gold and you can bury it deep in mud. You can leave it there for 100 years. And when you finally dig it up and pull up whatever clod of mud it might be in, and you get all that mud away from it, the gold is uncorrupted. And that is an exact picture of who we are. You know, at the beginning of creation, these individual souls were manifested, and this is, I'm way beyond my portfolio and even mentioning it, and I can't explain it. But at the beginning of creation, individuality, this individuality of each one of us, which is mind-boggling. Even to this day, I teeter on the edge of mental imbalance if I think about it too much. So I have to always pull back from the edge. But there's this inescapable individuality that is each one of us. And even though we were manifested purely from the infinite, there's also this outward pulling energy, which outward is synonymous with downward. Downward and upward has to do with the flow of energy in the spine. It's not a heaven is above and hell is below, even though that's how people talk about it. It's when we are more in tune with the spirit, we feel an elevating, rising energy within us. When we become discouraged and depressed, we collapse. Physically, that's how we manifest it all the time. You see it in children. You see it so graphically in children. When children are happy or excited about something, they literally just jump up and down because the energy is rising up their spine and it just keeps popping them off the floor. And when they become upset about something, you know, if the more dramatic ones will just throw themselves to the floor. They mean the energy is sinking and they collapse with it. When we're older, no, we sit up and we're very excited when something positive happens, and we tend to collapse downward when something negative happens. And once I was involved in a very painful interaction with someone else, and I actually fell to the floor weeping, and I was impressed by the fact that that could actually happen. That I was so distraught that I couldn't even hold myself upright, and I just collapsed on the floor. Which, of course, I'd heard about it and I'd seen it in others, but it was quite something to just feel your energy go that far down. So the whole process of the spiritual path is that the potential for saintliness, the potential for self-realization, sits right with us right now. We are merely a flow of energy, and that flow of energy goes upward or downward, and I started to say outward, because the difference is, if we are aware that our reality emanates from inside, and that our true reality is our internal state of consciousness, or if we imagine that our reality is outside of us. This is just a sideline, but there's this wonderful story that Swami used to tell us about a man who was a yogi and then he was a serious yogi, and then he became a college professor, and he became very interested. He was an Indian man who had settled in America, and he became very interested in studying the brain, and he did a lot of groundbreaking work in studying the brain, and he developed machines and so on. And because he was Indian, he knew that it would be very interesting to study the brains of advanced yogis. So he took a team with his equipment to India, and he came in contact with this particular very well-known yogi, Swami Purushottamananda, who lived for a long time outside of Rishikesh at a very holy site called Vasishtha Guha, a cave there, a cave in a little ashram. And so the man came and he wanted to measure the yogi's brainwaves. And at first they said they wanted to come on Wednesday or a certain day, and the yogi suggested that the next day would be more convenient. The professor said, no, the day I've chosen is really works best for our schedule, so the yogi said, fine. So they came that day, and the weather was terrible, and none of the machines would work. So they came back the next day, and then the machines all worked, and they hooked up the yogi's brain, Purushottamananda's brain, to these machines, but they got absolutely no reading from it. The machine was working, but there was nothing. And then the Swami just sort of looked at them, and they expressed their dismay because he didn't seem to have any brain waves. So the Swami said, "Oh, you want brain waves?" So then all of a sudden the machines just went crazy with the craziest brainwave patterns they'd ever seen. They couldn't make any sense out of it. It was all useless data. And the Swami just smiled at them. And then he said, "You scientists are just children." And that was that. That was all they got from him. So there is this reality where we look from the outside and try to understand things. That's a rather extreme story. And the professor had certain spiritual lessons to learn, Swamiji implied, that was also part of why all that happened. But it was also a fact. We look to the outside and think that we can figure all this out, where the true understanding comes from the inside. So the downward pulling energy is the outward pulling energy that invests us in this world around us and wants the outer world to sort of support us and define us. In a lecture I was listening to, a recording of a lecture from some time ago that Swami gave, it was actually that program Ask Me About Truth, which is a wonderful series of videos of each about 12 or 15 minutes where Swamiji is in conversation with Dharmadas and Nirmala about many questions. I think it's my favorite. It was done literally at the very last year of Swami's life, and it's just so relaxed, and the friendship between them is so palpable, and it's very informal, and it just goes in every direction. It's just wonderful. But he was talking about solitude and the benefit of silence. And he talked about how many people will go to the beach and carry with them, in that time it was a big radio, or they'll go to the mountains and they'll carry recordings with them, and they'll walk through the forest to the sound of these, this loud, often cacophonous music, or some sporting event or something. I mean, I understand if your team is playing and it's the playoffs, you may want to hear it. But his comment was more interesting than that. He said, well, I've added this to it, but it's like we sort of have to maintain a state of equilibrium between the internal and the external world. And if the external world becomes too silent and the internal world is still very agitated, then there's a compulsion to make the external world also agitated, so we will be in a state of equilibrium with it. The way Swami put it was really simple. People need to replicate on the outside whatever their inner reality is like. Oh, I see. That's why people like noise. That's why people keep the television running all the time, because the mind is always moving. And a person who has a calmer mind, or is trying to calm their mind, feels assaulted by all that constant movement. But a person whose mind is always agitated feels, I'm going to use the word, comforted by that constant movement. But that doesn't mean that comfort and happiness and fulfillment are the same thing. Because the problem is, until we resolve these two forces, just what I was talking about at the beginning, where I'll feel two inclinations within me, and I've gradually learned and gradually trained myself, and sometimes increasingly even don't have the conflict but just go in the direction I need to go, it's because I've been working all these years to throw off the ballast, the anger, the resentment, the self-concern, the carried over sadness, the fear of what will happen. This is all the ballast that keeps us from being able to be uplifted and surrendered into God's will. And I've stepped on a few karmic landmines in the last couple of months. So I mean, there was always the phrase karmic bomb, which was sort of part of our cultural vocabulary at Ananda, which is just something that just explodes in your life. And it doesn't have to, it can be, sometimes it's external, sometimes it's a sudden change, and sometimes it's just internal, where all of a sudden just something you didn't know was there manifests itself. I've begun to call them landmines, because that's sort of what it's like. You're just strolling along and you step on it and then you trigger it. And it's not created. I mean, the circumstances of your life don't create the explosion, but the circumstances may be ideal to detonate the explosion. I guess, is that the way to say it? But the explosives were already there. And one realizes, I realized, or one realizes, how much ballast is still in the basket of the balloon. How much fear, how much anger, how much unresolved sadness, how much somebody owes me an apology is still there. That's become my pet phrase for a kind of nameless, I've been done wrong, that is one of the blocks I keep in my basket. Somebody owes me an apology is how I think about it. You know, Swamiji taught us, trained us might be the right way to put it, and he trained us a lot by example. Because when you're caught up in one of these moods, when your energy is really being pulled down and outward, wrong attitudes make a lot of sense. And you find every reason in the world to feel that you are justified in how you are feeling. And then we put on these, whatever they are, and I definitely use the word we, to be irate or impatient or betrayed or heartbroken, and believe me, it's no joke when it happens. That Swamiji would often mimic, he would always play act terribly wrong attitudes in situations where it was comical rather than actual. The idea that other people have to, kowtow to your point of view, that you're important, that other people should be paying attention to you. You know, when the waiter walks by and doesn't notice that you're trying to signal him. Sometimes Swamiji would go into an exaggerated little monologue about how nobody ever listens to him. Why don't people listen to him? You know, he has so much to offer, and yet nobody ever listens to him. And all that had happened, of course, was the waiter didn't notice that he needed a glass of water or something like that. But when you would see Swamiji play acting, and he was a marvelous mimic, of these sorts of things, and we would all laugh at it, and it would be quite fun. And then in the way that happens when witty people are together, one person starts and then another one tops it, and then the next one tops it, and the next one tops it, and pretty soon you have this whole improv going of wrong attitude, all in a very lighthearted manner. And then when all of a sudden you start doing it for real, a little piece of you will remember what a joke it was. And so it becomes very helpful, because that's all the ballast that keeps us from rising into our actual spiritual potential. It's very hard for us as human beings, and it's very hard for me as a human being, to really appreciate how continuously that upward force is being offered to us. And in the stage of spiritual life in which I live, every so often it breaks through. I mean, from my childhood, every so often it breaks through, and this sort of what you might call boundless happiness just comes. By no means is it superconscious realization, but it's a tremendous sense of freedom and joy. And it breaks through. And what the feeling is like is it's like the absence of the downward pulling energy. It's not like, it's really odd. It's not like anything has been added, but rather that which has prevented me from feeling this has been taken away. Because when I see myself in those moments, what I'm aware of the fact is that I can't remember what I'm upset about. Like yesterday I was really upset about something, and now I can't even remember what it is. And people, with whom I may have had some reason to feel a little uneasy, I can't remember why I should feel uneasy. It's just, it all just disappears. And it's replaced by a marvelous sense of freedom. And then, karma being what it is, a little bit of the ballast, the rocks just sort of fill the basket begins to fall, and then suddenly you realize you're not soaring quite as much as you were. So the process begins again. And this is what the spiritual path is. People will talk to me about, just how depressing it can be. And I agree. It's just like, it's a long story. The spiritual path is very long. Long in the sense of you just have to keep at it. It's not long compared to eternity, but we're not most of the time living in eternity, so it's hard to compare it. But it's very simple, but it's not easy. And there's no shortcut. It's just, there's no shortcut. You just face the battle, and then you do it again, and you face the battle, and you do it again, and you face the battle, and you do it again. This is exactly what Arjuna is saying to Krishna. You know, what am I supposed to do? If I have understanding, and you say understanding is most important, why do I have to also do this? Because, well, the understanding will slip away from you unless you begin to act on that understanding and to bring the equilibrium between the inner perception and the outer expression. See, that's what Swami was. I mean, and Swami was, he was seamless. There was no interfering vibration. He was dedicated to God. He wanted God realization. He said, I've only had 2 desires in my life. He said, to realize God and to help others to realize God. That's saying quite a lot. He incarnated. He lived through all kinds of ups and downs. Lots of ups and downs in this world went through him. It was part of what he took on, is that all these experiences would go through him. But they just passed through him, and he had to deal with them, and he had to navigate the appropriate responses. But there was no ballast. There was nothing holding him back from doing that. In my own life, sometimes I want to do it, and sometimes I don't. I've had, as time has gone by, I must say, I've become more and more committed, or I should say, I've jettisoned more and more of those things that kept me from being able to be committed. Maybe that's the best way to say it. You think what I was saying a moment ago. I was talking to a friend recently just about, you know, just like what it really is to be on the spiritual path. You know, within Ananda now, there are many of us who have been doing this for decades, and we've been doing it for decades together. So these are friendships worth their weight in gold, worth many times their weight in gold. And I was talking about the fact that the problem with several of the karmic landmines that I've been through recently, and I can speak of them more lightheartedly than I felt when they were exploding around me, was that I knew I would have to get over it. And that has been an interesting mental state, which is that my greatest annoyance is that I know I'm going to have to rise to the challenge and overcome the limitation. And part of the delusion is I don't want to do that. I want somebody just to apologize to me and make me right just where I'm sitting. I don't want to transcend the desire to have it be somebody else's fault. I want it to be somebody else's fault. Now, I'm also doing right now exactly what Swami did with us. I'm making fun of attitudes at a time when I can joke about them, so that when they assert their ugly heads and try to pull my spiritual balloon back down to earth, I can remember that this is really not right. Because there is no shortcut. We just have to do it. So this is also what, because the battle of Kurukshetra is Arjuna actually having to pick up his bow and arrow and actually literally kill his cousins. But of course the whole thing is symbolic. And so it's not merely Krishna saying it's your duty to do it. He's saying to all of us as devotees, it is a battle. And if you actually think that you're going to gain mastery over the kingdom, Arjuna and his brothers were actually going to be kings of the kingdom, but mastery of the inner kingdom, self-mastery, which is what this is all about. We become master of ourselves. Swamiji writes that in The Path, that when he first came to Yogananda and became his disciple, and he talked about some relatives in Los Angeles, asking about what he was doing, and one of them protested, well, why do you call him master? Aren't we all free in America? Nobody is anybody's master. And Swamiji explained, we call him master not in the sense of master over us, but he's master of himself. And we honor him as master of himself, and we wish to become masters of ourselves. And this is what I'm talking about, these two impulses. The impulse that will just enmesh us and draw our balloon, so to speak, back down to enmeshment in the world of illusion and limitation, or we become master of those impulses that weight us down, and then automatically we can begin to flow upward. That's what it is we're talking about. And the reason the Gita has lived for so many centuries, and the reason even now, as we move from a lower age to a higher age, Master's mission was to interpret this scripture again. And the fact that it's on the battlefield is because it's fundamental for us as devotees to realize that we have to do battle against our own nature, those aspects of our own nature which weigh us down. But we don't have to hate them. We don't have to despair over it. We don't have to mutilate ourselves. We just have to recognize that this is a battle, and that I'm not just going to be able to sit here and have it all resolved. If I just sit here, well, I think it was, I can't remember, it was some author of Richard Bach. He wrote that book called Jonathan Livingston Seagull. I have no idea if that book is still popular or not, but it was a big influence decades ago. But he became a public speaker and a motivational speaker and so on, because it was a very creative philosophical book in the guise of a story about a seagull, Jonathan Livingston Seagull. And he said, you know, if life tries to inspire you to overcome your limitations, but if you instead cling to your limitations, he said, the reward for doing that is you get to keep them. Which was just putting it in such simple language. Forget all the highfalutin philosophy. If you fight to keep the state of consciousness you have, then you get to keep the state of consciousness you have. And that's it. You know, there's no eternal damnation. There's no God who's going to strike you with a lightning bolt. If you want to stay exactly as you are, you get to stay exactly as you are. So nothing happens until the effort to transform yourself looks more attractive to you than the pleasure of staying just as you are. And that was my twisted conundrum when I was suddenly, when some, profound ballast blocks, were exposed to me, and I realized I was going to have to lift those darn things out of the basket and heave them over the edge, and it was going to be a long, often painful process to extricate myself from terrible wrong attitudes. But what made me so upset was that I knew I had to do it. It was a big, terrible job, and I had to do it. Because if I didn't, I would have to keep them. And that was far worse. What I often say about tough karma is, seeing it once has been once too many. So I never want to see this karma again. That's basically my little mantra, whatever it is. It's enough that I'm seeing it now. I never want to see it again. And that's highly motivating, because all that happens is, if I don't overcome it now, in another now, which is going to be now when it's now, I'm not going to like it anymore then. There's just no way to postpone it. Reincarnation in that sense is, for me at least, tremendously liberating idea, because it liberates me from the illusion that I can get away with anything. You just can't. Because if you don't do it now, you'll do it in another now. But girding yourself for that battle, and this is, Arjuna asking Krishna one more time, like, why are you urging me to this terrible action? Which path will help me toward the highest good? Because sometimes it's not obvious to us which way is forward. And it's also not obvious to us because, and this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, there's no universal rules about which way is forward. We are a vibration of consciousness, and we have to become an ever more refined, ever more expanded vibration of consciousness. And so it just depends on what your vibration is, what is expansive for you. A lazy person who becomes energetic enough to become greedy and selfish is actually progressing. But a greedy and selfish person who suddenly realizes that he could use his accumulated wealth in a generous way, then he's progressing. And it's a hard thing to understand when we, on a planet in an age like the one we're living in, where there's such a mixture of consciousness all around us, that everybody is doing what they need to do in order to learn the lessons they need in order to progress spiritually. And God is on everybody's side equally. We are all God's children. He loves us all equally. He suffers when we suffer. I mean, this is the story, this is really deeply woven into Christian theology, is about the suffering of Jesus for us. But Jesus himself doesn't suffer. He just sees that we're going to suffer. And in his compassion tries to help us. And they do their best. And they plant in us the deepest understandings we're capable of receiving, so that at some point the effort to overcome our limitations will look more attractive to us than just keeping them. One moment in the company of a saint, it says in the Indian scriptures, will be your raft over the ocean of delusion. Because one moment in the company of a saint can open your consciousness to your own potential. And once you have that experience, however grandly or small it comes to you, of greater freedom relative to whatever one's present state is, once you feel that greater freedom, then it's always a vibration somewhere in your consciousness that makes everything else seem slightly dissonant. It's really just, it's the Om vibration calling you home. And we try to make enough noise over here so that we won't have to hear it, which is a lot of what's going on in our society. People are just, what do you plug your ears and then you start making a noise so you don't have to listen, when somebody starts saying something you don't want to hear. So the call of God is there, and he's saying, you're enjoying your selfishness, you're enjoying your greed, you're enjoying your sensuality, you're enjoying your false belief that you can make this world fulfilling. But then there's just this other note that always makes that slightly out of tune. And how deeply buried that other note is just depends on your karma, your karmic trajectory. But there comes a point where that note is so strong in you. And that's when you just automatically respond. It's like, why would I be angry with this poor woman who falsified her testimony and created all this trouble for Ananda? I don't need to be angry with her. There's no reason to be angry with her. She's just made a terrible mistake. It has nothing to do with me. My karmic reality was that I got to live through it, but she didn't do anything to me. She just gave me the opportunity to learn something. Why would I be angry at her? That note of divine harmony is so strong that it's the only note that you can sing. And you see, that's what Swami Kriyananda was like. I could remember what that sounded like when I was talking to people who were 22 years or more younger than me. I could remember because I could feel Swamiji here with me. And I could feel the purity of that note compared to some of the thoughts that were going through my mind. And much of the time was able to sing his song instead of the one that occurred to me. That's how the masters help us, by their presence and by their example. And then sooner or later, we become so adept at that. You learn the melody, just like anything else you learn. You learn that note, and you're able to sing it sufficiently that you get the freedom of floating free of all that ballast. And then nothing can persuade you to put it back in. Why would I ever do that? Why would I ever deliberately take the freedom of my soul and weight it down again with delusion? And that's where we're all going. This is what Arjuna says to Krishna, tell me which path leads to freedom, and I will follow it. God bless you.